David, one of my newest friends, welcome to the On Purpose podcast. How are you today?
So good to be with you and jealous of your tan as I sit here during my snow day where when I finish, I'm going to shovel for a couple hours and go for a walk in the snow. But I'm one of those crazy guys that I just love snow. The
Okay.
aftermath may be a little bit different, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be on with you and looking forward to this.
Oh, it's our honor. It's always a pleasure to share somebody's story with the world and to learn from each other. And that's ultimately what we're always here for is the power of story. Um, but before we get to yours, because honestly, preparing for your story was like getting ready to watch like a Hollywood thriller or a high-end movie. I was like, man, this is his real life. But just like snow shoveling today, David, I can't have you go out and start lifting the heavy snow right away. I got to warm you up a little bit.
I need the warm up too,
Yeah,
believe
yeah.
me.
All right. So you ready to get warmed up? These are some questions I like to ask to get our audience familiar with who you really are.
Ready to go.
All right. You get to have one food on a deserted island the rest of your life. David, what are you going to be eating?
It won't be the roast beef, okra, and iced tea that my mother fed us every single night. But if I had one single food, wow, that's a great question because um, you got to survive. It needs to be sustainable. I mean, I would say scotch, but that's probably not a food. Uh, my wife has influenced me a great deal. We have a potato very often because it supplies so many nutrients.
Right.
And maybe I just start there because I have never really thought about that. But I think you can practically live off of potatoes. The head of the National Potato Council here in Washington is a good friend of mine, a guy named Cam Quarles, great guy. So I'll say a potato.
I think I'd rather visit your island if it was Scotch.
I would pick scotch if I could find a way to make it sustainable.
Very cool, David. You get to have one superpower. What would your superpower be and why would you want it?
Well, I thought about that particularly because of my childhood. Um, I mean, the first thought would be to be the most powerful man in the world, the smartest. I would say mine would be to be invisible so that you could go anywhere without detection and listen and learn. Um, I'm kind of getting around the whole security thing and
Yeah.
how you would get in and out. But to me, that would be awesome just because my one of the things I've always wanted all my life is to learn everything I can about everybody. And I because of my childhood, I tried to live outside my house and be talk to any adult that would talk to me and go to places that others didn't go and listen to things that others wouldn't listen to. So off the top of my head, it would be to be invisible.
Mm, I love it. I love that curiosity that you had for your life, and we'll get into more into how that led you to this adult life you've had. But I think that's something that I always inquire or I try to get more adults to have is live a curious life. Even
Amen.
even as we get older, let's continue to learn and seek out stuff we
Oh,
don't know.
absolutely. The one thing that I learned as a child, and I learned it more than most because being inside my house was so impossible.
Mhm.
And I always got my hope and got my imagination going by being outside my house. But what I found is that people like talking about themselves. And if you let them, they'll tell you the damnedest things, right? And if you are interested in them, the next thing you know, you're deep inside their own mind. And there can be the most fascinating people right next to you,
Mm,
and you would never know.
I love it. I love it. No, that's 100% true. Besides The Pale Face Lie, which is a fantastic book, what is your favorite book?
That is another incredible question. And like you, I love reading. and I probably try to read 2 or 3 books a week. I mean, I've always done that, read as much as I possibly can. And this is one of those that's tough because they're different genres. I love history. I
Mm.
love memoir. I love biography. Um, I love some true crime, not as much as the fanatics. I've learned there are people who really love this stuff. Um, and I think of the greatest authors in the world, Shakespeare, Hemingway, um, and so many great contemporary writers. This is such a hard question for me.
Give me,
Um,
give me a memoir you read that you really that impacted you. That you're like, okay, this is something I should be adding to my life or looking into.
you know, um, and this is more of I met the author, so this helps me. And I met this author before I wrote my book. But Jeannette Walls, who wrote The Glass Castle, Jeanette's only a couple of years younger than me. Some of her life was in Arizona, like mine. And when I read her book about this kid that grows up with these two really crazy parents, and somehow finds her way through the entire process to become a successful adult. She's become a very successful adult, written more books. Um, I would pick Jeannette Walls and the Glass Castle because it triggered me to finally realize I could write a book and that I always like to say there's nothing special about me, but I had an incredible life. I knew that the things I was going through were extraordinary, whether I was or not. And I say that, I didn't have any superpowers. I didn't overcome the things I went through in life very quickly or very well. But by the time I was 10, I knew I was going through things that very few people had gone through. And so when I read Jeannette Walls' book, I thought, if I write this story, it really will be for the reason to let people know you can overcome things you don't think you can overcome. And I have learning disabilities that she did not have. Both our fathers were completely crazy, a little bit different ways, and both our moms were mentally ill and not in the exact same way. But she really inspired me, and her book really inspired me. So that'll be my answer.
I love it. You know what I love about you, David, is I love the humbleness and the genuineness that comes across you just in your conversation. And I think that is so important for people to realize that when we're humble to our own stories and we're humble to other people's stories, it kind of ties into your other answer. We get to learn from each other,
Well,
right?
you're very kind, and your humility has touched me the whole way. The thing that I live in Washington, D.C., which may be the arrogance capital of the world. But one of the things that I think everyone appreciates is genuineness. When I read all the self-help books trying to get myself kind of through my mess, the thing I was struck by is, you find people who are incredibly smart, incredibly wise, or they're physically incredibly imposing human beings. I had none of that. I think probably that the only thing I had that you would really want to emulate is resilience and persistence. That I kind of had this belief all my life, I'm going to find my way through what I'm going through. And I'm going to come out the other end better than I went through it. And if I have anything to say to people, is that if you're in the middle of a mess, whether it's physical, emotional, or both, don't give up and
Mm.
don't stop trying. You'd be amazed at the people you'll meet along the way and what those experiences will do to help you get to what I call the other side, which is a reasonably happy life where you can actually enjoy yourself and feel like not a victim and not like you got, you know, the worst end of the deal. All of us have the capacity to get to a better place, but you can't be bitter. You can't feel like you're a victim, and you can't give up.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And like, just listening to you, one of the key things there is you stayed open to continue to learn, right? And I think a lot of times one of the biggest disservice we can do to ourselves is close down and
That's
put
the
up all
biggest.
the walls, right?
Yeah, and I think back to my very first angel. I wrote about seven angels, and it was an 80-year-old Navajo woman who I met at a time when I was about 10 years old, living on an Indian reservation in the part of the reservation where Anglos really aren't allowed to live. And we lived there. Big, long story to that. But this woman would come over to our little shack every day and encourage me and get me to start my homework, open up a can of beans or something to get us going. And she would share stories with me. Her grandmother, at age 4, had walked back from the long walk, which was basically when the U.S. Army had walked all of the Navajos that they could find to Fort Sumter, 250 miles away, starved them virtually to death, and walked them back. And they shot anybody who was old, young, infirm, couldn't keep up. They just would put a bullet in their head and keep moving. Her 4-year-old grandmother survived that. And so Evelyn, her granddaughter, who was 80 when I met her, was full of love and mercy. And she taught me the Navajo word for basically for harmony, which is hazoni,
Tony.
or sympathy and love, which is ajuba. And every day of her life, she came over and comforted me and told me stories. And I believe she was the first person that ever showed me any unconditional love. And it opened something up in my head and my heart that I never forgot. No one would imagine that this old Navajo woman would walk over to a little shack where there were 4 kids with no mom and be a burst of light, happiness, and a person who would change my life. Every day of my life, I wake up and think about Evelyn, and I will never forget her. One of my greatest regrets as a young adult, when I finally realized what she meant to me, and I came back to thank her, she had died 6 months earlier. And I think it was one of the hardest moments of my life because I loved her so much and I wanted to let her know that.
Oh man, that's amazing. And I think, David, I gotta just tell you, I think you're letting her know it by sharing her story now, right? Like she,
I'd like to think that, and I'd like to think she knew what she meant to me. I never told her I loved her because I was scared she wouldn't say it back.
right?
But I know she did, Jerrod. I know she did.
Absolutely. Well, this might be our, we got one more warm-up question, but you may have just answered it. You get to have dinner with one person. Who would you have dinner with and what would you want to ask them?
Would it be living or dead?
Either way, you get to pick, my friend. It's your show, David. I'm just here with you today.
So, people would say Einstein or all the way back to Jesus. I would pick Evelyn and I would tell her that 10-year-old David Crow is now 71 years old, that she inspired me, that she picked me up at a time in my life when I desperately needed someone that loved me and someone that believed in me, that she cleaned all my cuts when the Navajo kids would beat me up because we're living in a part of the reservation they shouldn't live. The parents of my classmates had been put into the boarding houses where they shaved their heads, made them eat lye soap, and said, we have to kill the Indian to save the man. I went to school with their kids, and no wonder they hated us, for God's sakes. Eventually, they became very close friends, but those first years were miserable.
Yeah.
So I would be, instead of picking somebody famous or rich or something, I would pick Evelyn and I would sit down and say, you have no idea the impact you've had on my life, and I love you so much. And at the end of the meal, I would just want to give her a big hug and thank her.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and I would love to just throw out to our audience now that we got David all warmed up. Take a minute before we get into the story and think of somebody in your life that's paid an impact or made an impact for you, and let them know before they pass, right? Um,
Exactly right, because there were other angels. Evelyn was my first, but all of us can be an angel to somebody. I think society puts a huge premium. Are you incredibly good looking? Are you rich? Are you famous? We're in a Kim Kardashian world, and I'm not making fun of her, but the whole idea that there's all this glamour that you can only vicariously share. there's probably a kid next door, somebody at work, an old person down the street. You lend a hand to any of them, and you're making an impact that's beyond measure. And just be yourself and show up and be valuable.
Showing up is such a
Yeah.
key in the world, right? A lot of times we're looking for such a quick return that if we don't get it immediately, we don't show up again the next day. But you got to show up day after day. You don't know. Life is short, but it's long, right? Like the long part is you got to show up every day and put in that work and be there for people.
Amen.
Yeah, I love it. David, you feeling warmed up, my friend?
I am.
So let's start if you don't mind. I in researching you and getting ready for this interview, I was intrigued for how did you guys end up on the reservation? Your dad had gotten out of San Quentin.
I think this is a great story, how we got there. So my dad committed a crime that could have very easily gotten him the death penalty. He truly lucked out. He decided to kill a guy, and he drew an accomplice in, a guy who was absolutely unwittingly loved my dad and would do anything for him. So the two of them tried to kill this guy. Um, he would have bled out in a few more minutes, but his wife found him.
Mm.
The fact that the guy lived, and the fact that my dad got a great lawyer through a family connection that he didn't deserve saved his life. Um, but if you go back to the early 50s, I was born 9 months after my dad got out of San Quentin. My older sister, my dad, my mom was pregnant with her when my dad went to prison. So there's a big age gap between us. But when dad got out, he had two things in mind. He needed a job where you could avoid checking the violent felon box. People will forgive a lot of things, but it's a not top of your list to hire a violent felon.
Sure.
So he needed to go somewhere where you could fake up some references, lie about that, and be able to get hired. The other thing is he wasn't afraid of his accomplice who was going to get out of San Quentin about the same time he did. He wasn't afraid of him in a fair fight, but he was really afraid the guy would ambush him and kill him. And frankly, if you were the accomplice, that's what you would have done to my dad too, because he betrayed him. So my dad figured if he went to an obscure spot on the Navajo Indian Reservation and got a job, no one would check out his references because anybody willing to work there, they'd take you
Sure.
if you had any skill set at all. And this is no knock on the Navajos. It's just at that time there were not enough skilled people. And today, the Navajo nation has lawyers, doctors, accountants. They have tons of all the most qualified people. But when I was little, they did not. Right? Most of the adults had just gone through the boarding school process. You did not have high education. So dad could get a good job there right away. He could lie about his credentials and get away with it. And he figured his accomplice would never find him. He was right on both counts.
So how old were you guys when you moved out there then?
So I would have been about a year old.
Okay.
Dad gets out, um, maybe actually within months, because the first thing he did was go to work for the El Paso Natural Gas Company that had jobs on the Navajo Indian Reservation. Later, he worked for Bureau of Indian Affairs, but he got hired as a maintenance mechanic on the giant turbines for El Paso. And Dad was a smart guy. He was street smart, and he read every book in the world on math, physics, all that kind of stuff, even though he's only a high school GED graduate. But he did well there. Imagine a world pre-internet, pre-C-SPAN, pre-CNN. If you went to where I grew up in Arizona, and you could have been the biggest felon on earth, and if all you did was blend in and it wasn't hard,
Yeah.
there are a lot of crazy characters. No one in the world would ever come to look for you or ever think of. You would never cross anyone's path who would turn you in, unless you were Al Capone or something. I mean,
Yeah.
Dad was in a perfect place. He never listed our phone number. He never listed us in any directories. The odds of somebody finding out about him were 1 in a million, and he knew that. That's how we wound up there.
Yeah, crazy. When did you realize that your life was quite a bit different than your peers?
So, in my book, The Pale Face Lie, I'm almost four, and it's a blizzard. So, the part of the reservation we grew up on, is up at 7,500 feet. So, it's cold.
Yeah,
You're almost 2 miles high. So we had very, very hard winters in that part of Arizona. I mean, heavy snow, below zero, really. So one really cold day, I believe it was in March, it was still pretty wintry. Dad would take us out in our Rambler. I called it the Green Bomber. It's a green Rambler. And we would drive out, and he would just it's a frozen tundra. He would drive as fast as he could, slam on the brakes, and spin the car. And it was kind of like the Whirlybird ride I compared. Uh, and we just spun in over end, and Dad thought that was hilarious, and he knew I would like it. No seatbelts or anything. So you're bouncing everywhere. My book opens with this. So one day we're out there, and he said, I have to have a man-to-man talk with you. And you need to really understand what I'm saying to you. We have to get rid of your mother. She's crazy. And if you grow up with her, you'll be crazy just like her. And she'll ruin you. She'll ruin us all. So we have to get rid of her. And that's my first memory.
wow.
And I was scared because I love my mom. Believe it or not, she'll be 93 February 6th. Um, she's very fragile, very mentally ill.
Sure.
I love her to death. I can't believe she's lived this long. I'm glad she did, as she has. But Dad wanted to get rid of her. It's my first memory.
Do you remember the emotions that went into you hearing that?
Scared me to death. I wet my pants because I knew he meant it. Dad was always very mean, gruff. He would tie me to a tree to try to get out of it. He would throw me up in the air, and every once in a while, I'd move his hands and let me hit. He was trying to train me kind of to be as an accomplice, to be his sidekick. And he started that very, very young. And he would tell me about crimes that he committed. He would tell me about the stories they told in the yard at the San Quentin.
Yeah.
Everybody get together. Everybody in a federal penitentiary, by the way, is innocent. No one there's every person's there because of a travesty of justice. But they committed other murders and crimes that no one caught them for. And Dad would tell me these stories about these guys. It would scare the hell out of me. But I understood him. And part of my goal was I knew he was crazy and was an incredibly violent man. So if somebody cut him off in a car, he'd want to get out and kill him, right? And in my book I described the YV. So right between your eyebrows, above in your forehead, there's a blood vessel. When Dad was mad, his bulged like a garden hose, and his eyes bugged out like what I call a Volkswagen Beetle, and I call it the YB. And if he had the YB, somebody's going to die or wish they were dead. And so part of my goal was to try to catch Dad before the YB kicked in. If I could catch him before he got incredibly mad, I could talk him out of doing something stupid. But if the YB was in play, nothing stopped him.
How old were you when you recognized that was one of your roles to keep your siblings safe?
I'd say around 6 years old,
Oh,
because every weekend or every time we're out in the car had the potential for something really bad happening. And in my book, I put several examples out there. But Dad was built like an NFL linebacker, right? And if you look at my book, if you go onto Amazon and look at the pictures, you have one of my pictures is Dad's parole picture. And I swear to God, he looks like he could start for any one of the pro football teams today. He was really heavy set, really well muscled, mean. and no fear, and bad combination.
Yeah. And it seemed like he kind of isolated you from your siblings by telling you the stories, but they didn't know the stuff. How did you handle that role where you knew, okay, dad trusts me to tell me this stuff, so I gotta listen, I gotta preempt his violent streak, but I can't tell my siblings because I'm trying to keep them safe. How did you recognize that was going to be your role?
Well, early on, my younger brother, who's bigger, stronger, smarter than me, would it, and he's a wonderful brother. If you're listening to this, love you more than anything. But if you told him to keep a secret when he was a kid, he would immediately blurt it right back out.
Sure.
There was zero filter with him. And it got us both into a lot of trouble. He's probably the most honest guy I know. So dad didn't trust him because you said, don't tell anybody. He would immediately tell somebody. My sisters, who are gentle and kind and wonderful, and if you're listening to this, they're smart, lovely, um, but they wouldn't hurt a flea. Dad picked me to be his alter ego because he knew I would keep my mouth shut. And I figured this out early. And I really went along because I thought, we're four kids, no mom, and we've got to survive this thing. Somehow I have to live to be an adult. I
Right.
have to live long enough to get the hell out of this house. And I would listen to him and learn and hope I could help him not add things. But as you know from the book, I was very conflicted because I was his lookout when he would steal things. I would be his warning system. When we would go to populated towns, he was always worried George's accomplice might somehow figure out he was living near wherever we were. And so I was always the guy that looked out for anything unusual, a car license that didn't make sense, somebody who was in one of the reservation towns like Gallup, who didn't look like he belonged, wasn't a tourist going along on Route 66 or a
Yeah.
local. And my job was to kind of help dad. And I wanted that role. And as my readers know, there was the point he tried to get me to be an accomplice to murder and buried. And I, of course, rejected all of that and understood by the time I hit about 12 years old that he was completely crazy, was very violent. He thought there were people who deserved to be killed, and that was just the code, and that was perfectly okay. One of the things in my book that I put, that one of the huge moments where I realized how crazy he was, we were listening to a prize fight on the radio,
Yeah.
didn't have TV. And the readers know this. And there was a boxer named Benny Paret. If you go back and look at this, um, he was beaten to death in the ring. And he had made a slight against the other boxer, the trash talk stuff, that routine trash talk. But dad said before we listened to the fight, I hope Paret gets killed because he has crossed the line. You don't trash talk the way this guy did it. And in that fight, um, at the end of the fight, poor Benny Paret was beaten into the ropes, and the boxer was wouldn't let him fall down. And the refs never stopped the fight. The
Right.
guy couldn't even lift his arms. So when he fell to the floor unconscious, he never recovered. Dad thought that was the greatest thing in the world. You killed that SOB who broke the code. And during the fight, he's chanting, kill, kill, and he's screaming. And I'm feeling like, stop the fight. This is
Yeah.
no longer sport. This is some sickening gladiator thing that should never be allowed. And the guy who described the fight, Norman Naylor, other people described this fight. Um, they're saying, I've never seen a man get hit this hard. He can't fall down. And I'm like, God Almighty, stop the fight.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Dad's screaming. He nearly broke the windshield in the car because car radio is the only one that
Right.
really was good. And that's when I realized, oh my God, I am nothing like this insane guy. You don't kill people on vendettas. You don't take it in law into your own hands. He turned to me after the fight and he said, "You and I think exactly alike. The world may think we're crazy, but you and I know you have to even the score." And in my mind, I didn't say a word. I'm like, "You and I are completely different. And there's no way any part of this is how I want to live. This is not human.
Yeah.
Just not."
Do you think a moment like that where you recognize you're completely different was a catalyst to being open to learning from so many other people around you to find out like who am I more like?
Well, what's funny about Dad, it's funny you say that. Dad was the most curious human being I've ever met. He was the smartest person I think I've ever met. And it was different, kind of separate from his violent side. Like one of the things in my book, we pull off into the desert on 100-degree day. And it was a day where a lot of bad things happened. And I won't bore the listeners with this because you'd have to read the book to understand it.
Uh,
But we're out in the desert, and Dad had found a coyote caught in a trap, and he felt sorry for the coyotes. Of course, they're killing the Navajo sheep, and they obviously don't like this. And so they put a lot of traps out for coyotes. And also in the Navajo folklore, coyotes are considered devils.
yeah,
And I don't disagree with them, right? But Dad would let all these coyotes go if they're caught. He's like, these poor animals, they're just doing what animals do. So he carried beef jerky and water. And so he saw this coyote trapped. And he could tell the coyote hadn't been trapped very long because he was still very healthy. So we walked out into the desert a couple of 100 yards from the road, and we're in the middle of nowhere,
sure.
like somewhere between Fort Defiance and God knows where. It's still like that. You go 100 miles and only see one truck. So he pulls the trap off this coyote's paw after he put a towel around the coyote's head because the coyote's scared and he's hurt
Yeah.
and he's gonna bite if just because he's. So Dad would lift him in the air. He used the strength of his arm to pull that trap off, and God, I've never seen anything like them. Muscles and veins rippling. He puts water and jerky down, and we both carefully walk back. The coyote eats and drinks and eventually limps off into the desert. And Dad just looked at me and says, "Stop. Where are we?" And I said, "We're standing in 100 degrees heat in the middle of the desert. What do you think we are? New York City, Paris, London, Phoenix? What kind of question is that?" And he said, "Stop being funny. Where are we?" And I said, "Okay, we're somewhere between Fort Defiance, Arizona, and Gallup, New Mexico. We're on an August day. It's 100 degrees. You had to answer every question or he'd get really mad and hit you." He said, "Go back millions of years. We're in the middle of an ocean." And he describes Earth in geologic time all the way from pre-dinosaurs until the moment we are. And he turns to me and he said, "If you don't understand all of history, geology, anthropology, the English classics, economics, literature, then you're no more than that helpless coyote. You have to be smart about everything in the world, everything.
Interesting.
If you aren't, I'm going to quiz you and I'm going to yell at you if you don't get these answers. You're going to read about this. And the next time I ask, you're going to know." And Dad pushed us and pushed us to be very curious about the world. But then the other side of him is if somebody cut him off or gave him a funny look or he thought was rude, he'd want to kill him. It's the craziest dichotomy in the world. As he taught me, most of the people in maximum security prisons are idiots. They're not a very high IQ. They're perfectly prone to violence, which is why most normal people avoid people like that.
Sure.
But there's a small percentage that are super bright, but they have all those issues. Dad was that guy.
Yeah,
So he taught me to be curious, but I rejected the violence that was the other side of him.
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that's definitely a dichotomy. You don't hear those two things going together very often.
And they don't. And it's one of the reasons he was able to convince the prison psychiatrist that was the greatest BSer I've ever met in my life. I mean, he could talk you out of anything. And it was embarrassing when he'd start into these things. I go, oh my God, what's he saying?
Yeah.
But he convinced the prison psychiatrist that he was innocent. And he would tell him these stories, and the psychiatrist would actually get teary-eyed. And he'd go back to his jail cell and laugh.
Yeah.
And the one thing he told me, hope the listeners are not going to judge me on this. He said, the stupidest thing in the world is a white, highly educated liberal. They'll believe anything.
Yeah.
The easiest people on earth to trick because their only desire is to be empathetic. And if you're smart enough to trick them, it's like taking candy from a baby. That's how Dad felt. And that's how Dad acted.
Yeah, no, that definitely came across in your writing, reading that chapter where he was kind of bragging about being able to trick the psychiatrist to get the best job in the queue.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But if you're a prison psychiatrist and most of these guys are really stupid and violent, you know if you let them out, they're going to return to crime because they're not good at anything else. One of the funniest stories, I think the listeners will love it. So the prisoners would come up to each other when they were up for parole and they would like dress rehearse, right? Like you practicing for an interview or a podcast. They say, so if they ask me question A, what's the best answer? So this one guy had been in prison for beating a guy nearly to death. He got in a fight with him over something stupid. They both liked the same woman in a bar. They robbed a gas station, something dumb. Like all violent crime is dumb. And so they dress rehearse. And the guy asked Dad, so if the guy asked me if I ever be violent again, of course not. I learned my lesson. Prison rehabilitates people. I would be gentle. I would say, sir, I'm going to walk away now because there's no reason to be violent. And I said, Dad's going, these are great answers. Stick to the script. You have a shot. So the guy gets into the parole hearing and they go through the usual things. If somebody wanted to fight you, oh, no, I would never fight. No, no, no. And he said, well, here's a scenario. A guy walks up. You're dating a woman and you're in a bar with her. He puts his hand where it doesn't belong. He makes a pass at her. What would you do? I'd beat the guy to death. I'd kill him if I could. And the guy'd say, parole denied. He'd go back and he'd be totally confused about what he did wrong. So in theory, he would not be violent, but in any situation where he's provoked, he's going to go back and do the same dumb stuff. And that's most of these guys are idiots. They're untrainable. And he thought it was hilarious.
Uh,
Thought it was hilarious.
did you ever question his claim of being a Cherokee member?
Yeah, along the way, and of course, spoiler alert, he wasn't. Um, and I have a very good answer to why he believed he was, but you didn't ask that. So when Dad would tell us stories, the book is The Pale-Faced Lie, and he lied about a lot of things.
Yeah.
The way I could always tell, he would puff his chest out like he wanted to fight you. His face would get very animated. He'd almost go into the YB, whereas, and he would start telling these stories like he was King Kong standing on top of the hill, pounding on the little monkeys running up the hill. And whenever he got like that, I knew he was going to tell me a big lie. That was his tell. that he would go into and everything changed about him. His body chemistry, his face, how loud he spoke, and then you knew he was making the whole thing up. And on the Cherokee thing, he did it every time, every time.
And why did he believe he was Cherokee?
So this to me is the greatest psychiatry thing I can share with anybody, right? I help teach an abnormal psychiatry class on what you do with orphan kids. And I told them everything you're doing is wrong because you don't understand what it's like to be very abused. And so that's my long-winded way of saying Dad hated where he came from. He was raised by what he considered, and forgive this, Dust Bowl, Okie, white trash, right? The lowest of the lowest of the low. His mom and dad would drive around looking for cotton to pick. They lived in the back of a car in a trailer that was horribly old and broken down. And they forced their one child, him, to quit school and pick cotton all day, and they lived off of him. He hated them. He hated the way they treated him. So in Dad's mind, because where he grew up in southern Oklahoma, northern Texas, that's where all the Cherokees are, except for North Carolina. I think he decided that the Cherokees were a super race, that they were abused, they were mistreated, they were a minority, all those things. And that persona fit how he saw himself. It took me a very, very long time to figure this out. But one time, he stopped talking to me for 10 or 12 years, and then he needed me again before he died. And the end of my book is me reconciling with him and taking care of him. But he needed an identity that made him feel proud of himself. He needed to believe in something other than the something that he was really raised in. So if you asked him about his mom and dad, he would just launch into horrible, terrible, not much of a man, abusive. But if you asked him who he was a proud and noble Cherokee. And this split his personality into two and allowed him to be proud of himself. But for us kids, it allowed us to be proud of him, and our heritage was Cherokee too. And all of this myth was part of Dad the whole way. And once, as an adult, I did something really stupid. I went back, before there was Ancestry.com, I went back to where his family was raised in very northern Texas, about 80 miles from Dallas, in a place called Gainesville, Texas. And I went through all the rolls. The Mormons kept all these rolls that were amazingly accurate. So if you go through, and so did the census. So I found his family in the 20s and 30s, found his granddad, I found his great granddad. And I said, your father was named Meredith Taylor Crow. His father was Joshua Jones Crow. On the other side, their names are English and Irish. What in the hell are you coming up with this Cherokee thing? So Dad grabbed me by the throat and tried to get into a fist fight with me. By that time, I was an adult and pretty strong. I took his hand off my throat and said, don't you ever try to touch me again. It'll be the last thing you ever do. Yeah. Talk to me, but if you physically threaten me, I'm not going to put up with it. And so that didn't go over well. And he started screaming and cursing what an SOB and how horrible I was. And at that moment, I realized you can never challenge that myth. I never brought it up again, ever. Yeah. And so one of the funny things, about 6 months before Dad died, let's fast forward 30 years later, he was in a rehab center. And he was one of those patients that, you grab nurses by the butt. He was always asking if you'd slip him a scotch, or, he tried to break every rule in the hospital. And of course, that didn't go over well. And so he had fallen out of his bed at this rehab center. And so I got a call about 3 o'clock in the morning. Hey, you've got to come over here and help us get him back into bed. He's irascible. He's still a pretty good, big guy. We're having a hard time getting him back in bed. Would you please? So I said, sure, I'll come help you. So as I'm driving over, he accidentally, what I call, butt dialed me. So my number rings and I'm hearing this entire recording, and he's talking to a male nurse. And he said, just so you know, I'm a full-blooded Cherokee warrior. I have a roll number in Oklahoma. My people have fought the white man, and I go all the way back. So I'm driving at 3 in the morning. I'm laughing my head off. Not a word of this is true. Not even a word. And but this male nurse is like, oh my God, I'm in the presence of greatness. You're this Cherokee warrior. So anyway, by the time I got there, helped him get into bed and went home. So on the way out, the male nurse says, your father is the bravest, most incredible human being in the world. And I said, my father is so full of BS that if you stuck a pin in him, brown material would roll out. But let's make that our secret. This was always this is who he decided he was.
Sure. What would you say was the biggest key to you and your siblings breaking away from this cycle of violence and becoming happy, productive adults in our society?
I'd say my siblings are not happy adults, they're productive.
Mm.
This is really the long arm of our childhood has really hurt my two sisters. um, they're great people, love them both. I'm in touch with them a lot. My younger brother just acts like nothing like this ever happened. And I know there's a nurture nature part of life,
Yeah.
right? You can raise two kids and one's going to always be in trouble and the other's not. And I just read Arnold Schwarzenegger's book. It's really interesting, 7 useful things for life. And he had a brother who became an alcoholic, was killed in a car accident. His father was a former SS guard, raised the family in a very brutal way in Austria. Arnold decided he wanted the hell out of there and he got out of there. His brother became an alcoholic and wound up dying in this accident. Schwarzenegger makes the point, the same thing that destroyed my brother made me stronger. Well, I kind of have the same worldview about things that can happen to you that you either overwhelm you or that you break through. What I would say about my three siblings, they're all very gentle people. My brother, who's much bigger, stronger, wouldn't hurt a fly. He did not have a violent bone in his body. If you walked up and hit him, he'd just try and stop you.
Mhm.
I think they inherited that from my mom's side. Um, I just think that none of us inherited the desire to be violent. And when you try to be violent with any of the four of us, we rejected it,
Good.
right? I mean, um, I'm not smart enough to tell you why.
Sure.
All four of us got a good chunk of our dad's intelligence, and all four of us did well. My
Yeah.
two sisters, teachers, my older sister, a professor of teachers, my brother, very bright, did several different things with his life. Um, he was smart. No one really wanted to get in trouble, and no one wanted to hurt people or do anything bad. They're good people. You ran into any one of my three siblings on the street, you would meet a good person.
Sure.
Um, Dad never understood why I didn't believe in violence. He said, surely you want to go back and one day we're talking about all the Navajo kids that had beat me up. He said, well, why don't you just go back and beat the crap out of them? I said, why don't you understand how they were raised and why they felt the way they did? And how would you like to have been raised the way they did? How would you like to have been their fathers raised in boarding school? He said, I have no idea what's wrong with you.
Mm.
There's only two things in life, getting even and getting ahead and taking whatever you want. I said, I'm not buying that. I think there's a lot more to life than that, and I have no desire for that. He didn't understand me. I understood him.
Yeah.
I understood it. I didn't want anything to do with that, and neither did my siblings. None of them wanted to be anything like that, and they are not.
That's fantastic. What would you say, David, was the hardest part in deciding to write this memoir and as you write like when I wrote my book and reflected back on things, you're reliving it, right? You're feeling the emotion again, the trauma, if you will. What would you say was the hardest part for you in deciding to write this?
One, I can't wait to read your book and comment on it.
Well, thank you.
Forgive me for having done so. I think the hardest part, my wife didn't want it, my kids didn't want it, my siblings didn't want it. I wrote the book only because I wasn't trying to get even. There was no evening the score, telling people how sorry I felt. None of that. I wanted people to know that my whole life I lived a lie. I had to pretend none of this happened. You don't want to talk about these things in front of polite company. Most people, their dad's their hero. Their mom's a wonderful person. My mom is a wonderful person, but she's very mentally ill and she couldn't. So none of these things were my reason. My reason was simple. I'd had to hide my whole life. I wanted to tell people you don't have to hide. You can tell your story. You cannot be a victim. You can get through these things. You can become a better person than how you were raised. But the hardest part was overcoming that no one in my life wanted me to do this.
What's the reception been like now that it's out and it's doing very well?
Incredible.
Okay.
Um, my my wife's family, wonderful family, all of them read the book, gave me big hugs, said, "Oh my God, we had no idea," and we're super positive. That one of the real rewarding things is all my college friends who knew things were really wrong but didn't know why were incredibly receptive. I probably sold 5,000 books just as the kids. um, Even my accomplices, my dad's accomplice's son read the book and sold a bunch of books for me. The reception among my friends, my clients, and people I've met has been off the chart positive.
Wow.
I never been more gratified in my life. My children, and still they're proud of me, but they don't really want anything to do with it because it was a very negative thing.
Sure.
The Crow family name, um, in my parents' generation, not a positive thing. Um, my siblings are proud of it, but we don't talk about it very
Yeah,
much. Um, but the reception I've had has been 10 times more than I ever thought. And I think the reason is simple. Again, I feel like a very ordinary person who got through an extraordinary time
for sure.
simply by not quitting.
Yeah.
Reader can see, like I'd make 2 positive steps, 3 negative steps. I do something smart, I do 4 things stupid. And they saw how hard I struggled all the way through my adult life till my 50s before I began to understand what happened and undo the damage to me. Once I fully understood what broke me when I was 10 years old, really where I broke, when I recovered from that by simply not blaming myself and then forgiving the people who did this to me, my life opened up and it changed completely. And I had a brand new life. And it was a life I never thought I'd have.
Mm.
I wanted readers to say, this can happen to
Yeah.
you. The saddest letters I get, and I get a bunch, are from older people, often female in this part. I was raised to think I'm fat, stupid, dumb, you name it, because, and I've never been able to trust anybody, love anybody. I'm going to die alone. I always answer, you're not fat, dumb, stupid, or anything else. You were told this by bad people who didn't really love you. If childhood is a city you can never leave, it destroyed you. You have to find a way out of that.
Yeah.
They've said, I'm happy for you. I can't. I will die alone. The other letters that really break my heart are from prisoners. And I get a bunch. I have a big prison fan club. It's weird. And I'll say, I was raised just like you.
Yeah.
And I'm in my 3rd stint at the big house. I had to do this because it's how I was raised. And I'll write them and I'll say, look, you can actually make some good decisions. One guy said, my children are going to not be there at my deathbed because I've been such a bad dad. I said, get out of prison, be a good dad,
Yeah.
support the mother of those children, even if financially do the right thing. And you know what? At your funeral, your kids are going to be your biggest heroes. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
People are going to judge you. They're going to
Yeah.
not give you for lots of bad decisions. You make enough good decisions in a row, you can get some of this behind you.
Yeah.
But those 2 kinds of letters break my heart, and I get a lot of that.
You said something interesting today that I want to ask about is your dad's accomplice's son has reached out to you.
Well, I reached out to him. This is one of the most touching things that have ever happened in my life. So I'll mention his name. He won't mind. His name is Jeff Wolverton. His dad was George. And George Wolverton helped my dad try to kill this guy. George never told his family what happened. He essentially was talked into trying to kill this guy because my dad said this guy had violated my mom's pride. He
Sure.
went, he helped. He never understood why he got arrested because all he did was do what his best friend asked him to do.
Yeah.
So through all the records and did a Freedom of Information Act at San Quentin and went through every record I could find. I tracked what I thought might be his descendants in a place called Parsons, Kansas. So one day, about 10 years ago, I picked up the phone and called this number, the number I had, and I said, "Does are either one of you related to George Wolverton?" The wife said, the woman said, "Yes, my husband is George's son." Was his father in San Quentin? Long silence. Yeah, how do you know that? And I said, "I know why he's there. I know what he did wrong. And would you have your husband call me?" He called, and I came and visited him in Parsons, Kansas. I had all the Freedom of Information Act stuff. I had a picture of his dad. All his dad had told him is, don't help save a woman's honor in California. That's all he knew.
Oh, wow.
He knew nothing. So I asked for forgiveness. Jeff and his wife Penny are the nicest people in the world. They have made, and Jeff has made a huge success of his life. And his dad died penniless. He could never get a job because he couldn't get the violent felon thing off his record. All you have to do is violate parole in a minor way. If you're a violent felon, you never get a
Yeah.
chance to be pardoned. And George made a bunch of mistakes. So Jeff and I have become good friends. I offered his daughter an internship with my lobbying firm. She took it. She's a wonderful intern. Yeah, I said, I can't do a lot of things. I can't erase this. So my dad hadn't died yet. And I told dad I'd done this, and he went nuts. He said, "Don't you ever talk to me and get the hell out of my house." I said, "Oh, I'll be glad to. Now I don't have to put up with all your crap. I don't have to be your medical legal guardian anymore. No one will talk to you in the family. Thank you for now. I feel completely relieved that I can walk away from you and not have any guilt. The next day, call me back. Get over here. But you can never bring up anything about George again." And I said, "Okay, I won't, but I want you to know I'm going to write a book after you pass, and I'm going to tell everybody everything. You destroyed this man's life, and you never did anything to help fix it. And you never admitted that you're the only reason he went to federal prison."
Yeah.
And I had one of our most bitter fights, but he was less than a year to live, and I decided, hey, back off. But anyway, Jeff and I are good buddies. He has had book clubs and helped sell books.
Amazing.
Yeah, and he's just a super wonderful guy. He buys houses and rents them out and fixes them up. He became an engineer, and believe me, he didn't have a dime.
Yeah.
He did everything he did by reading at night and studying and working. This is a guy that grew up without a penny, and he's probably one of the nicest, completely well-adjusted, happy, successful adults you'll ever meet in your life. Jeff Wolverton, you're one of my heroes.
Dan, I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation, sir. It's been such an honor to have you on, to share your story, and to just to get to understand everything that went behind your life, your success, and thank you so much for being courageous enough to share it with the world so others can learn from it.
Jerrod, you're my friend. Anytime you're ever in touch with me, I'll be in touch with you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope I get a chance to meet you in person sometime.
Well, we'll be out in Virginia in the fall of 2024, so maybe we'll make that happen.
Would you please?
I would love it. And for our community, be sure to get over to davidcrowauthor.com. And The Paleface Lie is available wherever books are sold now. You will not regret spending some time learning more about this.
Jerrod, thank you so much. You've made my day, and it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.